Well, what do we need to be happy? For so many people in this world, I think that question can be answered with one word: more. There's another term that we could use for this in our world today. There are countless books, videos, podcasts, you name it, all about hustle culture. This idea that there's always more money to be made, there's always another promotion to get, there's always one more hill to climb to get to the top, or at least to achieve your own goals and to be successful in whatever way you see fit. For some, that might be to earn as much money as possible. I've got a friend from varsity days who he put on Twitter, in 5 years, I will own this fancy car. I forget what it was, a BMW or something. In 5 years, I'll own this car. Save this tweet and hold me accountable. For another friend in the corporate world, the conversation among their colleagues is constantly about how to be more successful, make better investments, make more money, to have nicer things. For others, it might just be to have security, or to be able to go to a restaurant and read the menu from left to right rather than from right to left. While I was studying music, another friend, he tried to get me to join what turned out to be a pyramid scheme. But just putting the business model aside for a moment, what he and so many others who were involved in this thing were telling me, actually as a way of trying to rope me in, but the experience that they were letting on is that what they were after was actually just financial security. For some who didn't have that growing up, they wanted some stability that they hadn't had before, or in other cases, just a bit of financial independence, which again they hadn't had. Hustle culture is all around us, in big ways, in small ways. We're surrounded by pressures to get ahead, to achieve this, to experience that, and it's an ever-moving target, quite often set by somebody else, not by ourselves. Now we're in part 2 of a walk through the book of Ecclesiastes. Like I mentioned last week, we're doing a bit more of a thematic approach than just this passage followed by that passage followed by the other one. We're rather taking some core themes in the book and just pulling them through and see what the book as a whole has to say about it. Last week I suggested that although it's been common, or it's been popular, to think about Ecclesiastes along with Proverbs and Job as wisdom literature of the Bible, that's probably not the most helpful way of thinking about them. Sure, as we'll see today, Ecclesiastes does have a lot to say about wisdom and some really important things to say about wisdom, but it also talks about a whole lot of other subjects as well. Part of the reason, though, that Ecclesiastes has been put into this wisdom literature box, at least for why some people have put Ecclesiastes in this wisdom literature box, is its connection with King Solomon. For a long time, the assumption was that Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon. There's a tradition among the rabbis, the early Jewish interpreters, that Solomon wrote Song of Songs early in his life when he was young and full of vigor. He wrote Proverbs a little bit later on when he'd acquired some wisdom, and Ecclesiastes toward the end of his life when he was this weathered old man who just gives this heavy dose of realism. You can see why we might associate a book like Ecclesiastes. It has some really important things to say with King Solomon. He was Israel's archetypal wise king. He was the epitome of wisdom in their history. But to be honest, that probably isn't true either, that Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon. True, the book does open with 1 verse 1, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Strictly speaking, not many people fit the bill there. But in 1 verse 16, he says, I have increased in wisdom more than anyone who's lived in Jerusalem before me, or ruled over Jerusalem before me, rather. Namely, my dad. Not this big claim that he seems to be going for here when he says that I've been wiser than them all. And especially when you compare that with the rest of the things that he says about how he's grown in wisdom. It's meant to be this impressive feat. Not so much when you compare it to one person. Another reason why it's probably not Solomon is that later on in the book he sees all sorts of injustice and oppression, and he doesn't seem to be able to do anything about it. It doesn't really give the impression that we've got a king in view here. He seems like more of a bystander, of an onlooker, somebody who sees all this oppression, laments the oppression, but actually can't do anything about it. So it's very unlikely that Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes. That said, the title and certainly the first 2 chapters very strongly suggest that Solomon was still in view. What the writer was doing, rather, was with his own situation in mind, which we said last week was sort of the 3rd century BCE, where they were caught in the crossfire. Jerusalem was caught in the crossfire between fights between 2 nations. In that situation, what the writer seems to be doing is impersonating Solomon, to talk about wisdom, work, and wealth as the one who, in Israel's history, actually would have been the most qualified to do so. So he's pretending for a moment. Imagine I'm Solomon. Let's think about these things. Let's put on this big thought experiment as if I was Solomon. And here's what my perspective is. Solomon would have been the most qualified person to think about, to speak into these things. And when you read Solomon's story in 1 Kings or 2 Chronicles, we can actually see why. So we're going to start this morning by thinking about the achievements of Solomon. The achievements of Solomon. So the way Chronicles sums it up, Solomon built a huge force of chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. The king made silver and gold as plentiful in Jerusalem as stone, and cedar was as common as the sycamore fig trees that grow in the foothills of Judah. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Sicilia. The king's traders acquired them from Sicilia at the standard price, and then goes on to say that he actually sold them for a fat profit. When the Queen of Sheba comes to visit in 2 Chronicles 9, we're told that she was amazed at the food on Solomon's tables, the organization of his officials and their splendid clothing, the cupbearers and their robes, the burnt offerings that Solomon made at the temple of the Lord. Ecclesiastes then paints a similar picture. The teacher says, "Come now, I will test out, or I'll try out joyfulness to see what's good." And he enjoys good food and fine wine. In verse 4, he says, "I've accomplished great things. I built houses, planted vineyards, made gardens and parks, and filled them with every kind of tree." He had servants, livestock, and more money than he knew what to do with. And having lived the dreams of so many in our world, what's the conclusion that he comes to? It's hevel. Hevel, if you were with us last week, you'll remember hevel is a Hebrew word meaning vapor or mist. It's ungraspable. It's elusive. Just as you think you've grabbed hold of it, it slips through your fingers. About laughter, I said it's foolishness. About joyfulness, I said, what is this? It promises so much satisfaction, so much happiness, but it doesn't deliver. And in any case, I could work so hard, I could hustle all of the hustle, and what? I could leave it to somebody else who hasn't worked for it, who doesn't care about it, who hasn't worked for it, and who squanders it. And even while it is mine to enjoy, it still adds all of this stress. Verse 22, "What is there for a person in all their labor and worries as they toil under the sun? For all their days are a sorrowful and vexing business. And at night too, their mind doesn't rest." You've got all these things, and now you need to look after them, and you're worried that somebody's going to break in and steal or whatever. It just causes you to worry. It's hevel. This too, it's hevel. It's ungraspable. It's elusive. In chapter 4, we have a picture of somebody who works. They don't need to, but they just can't put it down. There's an insatiable appetite for more. And so they're working. 4 verse 4. I saw that all toil and all achievement spring from one person's envy of another. This too is ungraspable, a pursuit of the wind. Fools fold their hands and ruin themselves. Better one handful with tranquility than 2 handfuls with toil and a pursuit of the wind. One writer explains it this way: the teacher is not indicting the working class and the poor who must work to survive because they are exploited by others. Rather, he's looking to those who could afford to work less, yet work more because jealousy drives them to have more than their neighbors. They are the middle class and elites who strive to acquire more power and all the wealth that comes from it. Another scholar suggests that maybe that word jealousy in 4 verse 4 or 5, in those verses, that word jealousy should actually be translated passion. And he explains that the teacher's observation accordingly is that work and ambition come to constitute an all-consuming passion. We might speak of an obsession that isolates people from those around them, but one which is in itself a form of delusion and a quest to catch what cannot be caught. More could be said, but I think the point is made. We can hustle all we want. We can have all the things. At the end of the day, it's hevel. It doesn't deliver on everything it promises. That isn't to say there's no enjoyment to be had. Ecclesiastes 3:12-13 says that talks about the fruit of our labor being a gift from God that we're right to enjoy. In 8:15, the teacher says, I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Their joy will accompany them in their toil and all their days of the life that God has given them under the sun. The teacher is not saying that there's no value in work and no joy to be found in wealth, but he cautions us against putting too much stock in it. At the end of the day, we could put in all this effort for something that we can't take with us, and we might well find that it's left to somebody else who'll just squander it. At the end of the day, we might find that we tried so hard and got so far, but in the end, it doesn't even matter. What then about Solomon's wisdom? We said earlier that Solomon was known for, and is the archetypal king that was sort of the embodiment of wisdom. So let's think together about the wisdom of Solomon. Glancing back at Chronicles real quick, God effectively writes Solomon a blank check and says, ask for whatever you want, go for it. So quite famously, what does Solomon ask for? Right, he asks for wisdom. He doesn't ask for wealth. He doesn't ask for all the pleasures that he could have asked for. He asks for wisdom. And then he puts his wisdom to work, bringing about a golden age in Israel, unlike anything they had seen before and anything they'll see again. Again, a similar picture is painted in the first 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes. In 1:13, the teacher gave himself to investigating with wisdom everything that happens under the skies. In verse 16, behold, I have made myself great and increased in wisdom more than anyone who has come before me in Jerusalem. But again, the end result is that it just isn't all that it's cracked up to be. In 9:13-18, there's a story told of a powerful king who lays siege against a city. But the people of the city are saved because there's this poor man but wise man who manages to work things that they're saved. Now, we're not told who he was, what he did, what the situation was. It's painted in pretty vague terms. But the conclusion that's drawn there in 9 verse 16 is wisdom is better than strength. But just a couple verses later, it might well be that wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. As dead flowers give perfume a bad smell, so little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. Coming back to chapter 2, the teacher has pursued all these incredible ventures and accomplished all these impressive feats, and he did so by means of his wisdom, by putting his wisdom to work. But in verse 15, he comes up empty. I said to myself in my heart, the fate of the fool awaits me too. So why have I been so excessively wise? And I said in my heart that this too is hevel. It's elusive. It's ungraspable. For the wise person, along with the fool, won't be remembered forever. In the days that have already been, they've already been forgotten, and the wise person dies along with the foolish. In the end, the wise don't accomplish more than the fool. They just have a more acute understanding of their limitations. With much wisdom comes much vexation, and increasing in knowledge means increasing in sorrow. So what's the point? Why even be wise? Well, it's not as if wisdom has no value. In 2:13-14, I saw that there is more profit in wisdom than foolishness. For like its profit is the difference between light and dark. The wise person has their eyes in their head, but the fool walks around in darkness. And 7:11-12, wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing and benefits those who see the sun. Wisdom is a shelter as money is a shelter. But what makes wisdom better, or what makes knowledge better, is this. Wisdom preserves those who have it. You can fall back on money when life throws you a curveball, but when it's gone, it's gone. Wisdom isn't going to leave you, and in the event of a crisis, can even help you get back on your feet. I think that's the thinking that's going on in these verses. So wisdom is a virtue. It is worthwhile, but it has limited value. It is a good thing and is always better than foolishness, but it can only take us so far. At the end of the day, the wise and the foolish both die. Neither the wise nor the foolish can take what they have with them, and wisdom offers no guarantees that things will go to plan. So with this perspective, in light of the heavy dose of realism that Ecclesiastes gives us that has just warmed our hearts this morning, what do we need to be happy? Well, I think the best person to ask is the one who's wiser than Solomon. So that's where we're going to land this morning, the one wiser than Solomon. In one of his standoffs with the Pharisees, Jesus actually says to the Pharisees in Matthew 12, "The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to listen to Solomon's wisdom, and now something greater than Solomon is here." Calling to mind what we saw earlier, where the Queen of Sheba actually came to listen to Solomon's wisdom and was just so impressed with everything that she saw and so blown away by Solomon's incredible wisdom. A foreign queen acknowledged Solomon's wisdom, but now one greater than Solomon has come, and God's own people can't recognize his wisdom. And so this king wiser than Solomon says in Matthew 6, "Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves break in and steal. It's perishable. It's fleeting. It's hevel. No, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." What do we need to be happy? The fact of the matter is, you can be as wise as Solomon and pursue every pleasure under the sun, but when you've done it all and found that it all comes up wanting, consider Jesus' words. Seek first God's kingdom and righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Now, for the record, I don't think God is writing us a blank check to say, well, trust me, and then all those things that you were pursuing, that you're trusting me instead of pursuing, I'll give you those things. Remember what Jesus said earlier in verses 19, 20, 21. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, because that is what's valuable. That is where true worth, true happiness, true satisfaction is going to be found. Put first God's kingdom, and that's what will be added to you. A pearl of great price. Seek first God's kingdom and righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. And whether you're like my one friend who wants us to hold him accountable so you can buy his BMW, or my other friend who's hustling to find financial stability or independence, hear Jesus' words when he says, don't worry about your life. Don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or drink, or your body, what you'll wear. For all Solomon's splendor, he had nothing on the lilies of the field. And if God can care for them, he can care for you too. John Piper famously said that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. Because when we boast not in our wisdom or our work or our wealth, but in Jesus' death and resurrection, it brings him honor as the world looks on and sees the happiness to be found in God. It brings him glory as the world looks on and sees just how deep the Father's love for us really is.